The value that the modern West assigns to an unassailable original has resulted in all of the following except. Now, this is a deceptive question, so let's be cautious about this. Notice that this is talking about an unassailable original, which is a reference from the fourth paragraph here. But our normal tendency would be to go to the next paragraph to see what this is talking about. That is not going to work out. Notice also that this talks about the modern West, and here we are talking about the 17th century, the West in the 17th century. So this is not the reference that we are looking for. What we actually need is here, mostly here in the third paragraph. Let's look at the options. Option 1 says, it allows regular employment for certain craftsmen. Very true. In the present day, the modern West, we see that in the Cathedral of Freiburg Minster in southwest Germany, there is work continuously going on. It's covered in scaffolding almost all year round. The sandstone from which it is built is very soft, porous material that does not withstand natural erosion by rain and wind. After a while, it crumbles. As a result, the cathedral is continually being examined for damage, and eroded stones are replaced. So those who replace these stones, these craftsmen, they are given employment on a regular basis because of this. And in the cathedral's dedicated workshop, copies of the damaged sandstone figures are constantly being produced. So again, these copies being produced of the original figures, etc., sandstone figures, we find that this is very true. We can infer this. So this is something which has resulted from the modern conception of the original or the preservation of the original in the West, which means one is not a valid answer. Option 2 says it discourages them from making interventions in ancient art. Now, interventions is an idea which is introduced in the fifth paragraph. We can eliminate this option by this very paragraph, the idea that this paragraph, the fifth paragraph, gives us. And to an extent, there is a reference, there's a specific reference, but a reference nonetheless in the third paragraph. First off, the fifth paragraph says, back in the 17th century in the West, excavated artworks from antiquity were treated quite differently from today. Notice this phrase, it's very important. Excavated artwork in the 17th century, that is, were treated quite differently from today. What was the treatment then? They were not restored in a way that was faithful to the original. Instead, there was massive intervention in these works, changing their appearance. So changing their appearance was something that was done back in the 17th century. It is not something which is done in the present day, in the modern West. And that we can see from this reference. Of course, and we have seen this after we see that the stones in the cathedral are continuously being examined for damage. They're being replaced. The damaged sandstone figures are constantly being reproduced. Their copies are being produced. Of course, attempts are made to preserve the stones from the Middle Ages for as long as possible. But at some point, they too are removed and replaced with new stones. So there is an attempt to preserve the original stones, the stones from the Middle Ages. Also, in the past, there were massive interventions in artwork which were excavated, which were damaged due to time and due to the elements. But that is different, very different from what is done today, which means today there isn't a scope of, or there isn't the tendency to make interventions, to make changes to artworks which have been excavated. So they're changing their appearances, interventions in these works. That is not done in the present day, which means this is also something which has resulted from the unassailable original. 2 is incorrect. 3 says it discourages them from carrying out human cloning. Now, this is close somewhat, but there are two problems. First off, the reference that we are looking for, an unassailable original, that is, the reference of the question, is here in the fourth paragraph. We have cloning, human cloning, mentioned or introduced in the last paragraph, the sixth paragraph. First off, this is not directly connected. There is a connection, but it's not direct. It is not because of the conception of the unassailable original that there is less idea of cloning, or there's less there are more scruples about cloning among Europeans. Also, it is not definitive because it is stated it is probably this intellectual position that explains why Asians have far fewer scruples about cloning than Europeans. We see that it is mentioned that the South Korean cloning researcher Huang Woo-suk, who attracted worldwide attention with his cloning experiments, is a Buddhist. So there is an aspect of religion here. We see Buddhism versus Christianity in terms of their perception of cloning. We also see Europeans. So there's a notion of European versus Asians, not exactly the West, not entirely the West. So again, contributing to the fact that this does not directly connect cloning, not definitively, to the idea of the unassailable original that has developed in the West. And then again, this is probable because it says it is probably this intellectual position. So 3 has some doubt in it. There's reasonable doubt with 3. There's reasonable ambiguity. So we can qualify 3. Option 4 says it discourages them from simultaneous displays of multiple copies of a painting. Now, this is something which throws us off because this seems to be something which is outside the premise. Also, making interventions, if we were to blindly follow the next paragraph after the reference, then we would probably select 2 as the correct answer. But we can see that 4 is also not true. This we can see most prominently. There's no direct reference to this, simultaneous displays of multiple copies of a painting or artwork, but there's some reference to this at the end of the first paragraph. Let's read the last 2 or 3 statements. The discrepancy with regard to the understanding of what a copy is has often led to misunderstandings and arguments between China and Western museums. So this does represent the conception of a copy among the Westerners. The Chinese often send copies abroad instead of originals in the firm belief that they are not essentially different from the originals. The rejection that then comes from the Western museums is perceived by the Chinese as an insult. So the Westerners, the modern Westerners, they do not believe in displaying of copies of paintings, which includes simultaneous displays of multiple copies. So we see that this is also a resultant of the Western idea of an unassailable original, an original which cannot and should not be altered. So 4 is also eliminated. The closest answer is option 3. Which one of the following statements does not correctly express the similarity between the Ise Grand Shrine and the Cathedral of Freiburg Minster? The Ise Grand Shrine has been introduced here in the second paragraph, and the Cathedral of Freiburg Minster in southwest Germany here in the third paragraph. These 2 paragraphs, they talk about these. Let's look at the options. Option 1 says both are continually undergoing restoration. On first glance, this seems correct because it is mentioned here. The Ise Grand Shrine in Japan is 1300 years old for the millions of Japanese people who go there on pilgrimage every year. But in reality, this temple complex is completely rebuilt from scratch every 20 years. So it is restored, it is completely restored every 20 years. Then again, the Cathedral of Freiburg Minster in southwest Germany is covered in scaffolding almost all year round. Why? Because there's construction going on continually. The sandstone from which it is built is very soft, porous material that does not withstand natural erosion by rain and wind. After a while, it crumbles. As a result, the cathedral is continually being examined for damage, and eroded stones are replaced. And in the cathedral's dedicated workshop, copies of the damaged sandstone figures are constantly being produced. Of course, attempts are made to preserve the stones from the Middle Ages for as long as possible, but at some point they too are removed and replaced with new stones. So at first glance, it seems as if this is a valid answer, but actually, it seems as if this is a similarity, but actually it is not. This is a valid answer. We'll see this from 2 references. First off, we see that with the Ise Grand Shrine and the Cathedral of Freiburg Minster, both of these are mentioned as a point of difference between the Eastern notion of identity and the Western. We see that from the first statement of the second paragraph. The Far Eastern notion of identity is also very confusing to the Western observer. So there is difference between the 2. This is a difference that we've also seen reference in the first paragraph. The Chinese often send copies abroad instead of originals in the firm belief that they are not essentially different from the originals. The rejection that then comes from Western museums is perceived by the Chinese as an insult. This discrepancy has been discussed here. Also, we see that there is a point of difference between these two, as mentioned in the fourth paragraph. Fundamentally, this is the same operation as with the Japanese shrine, except in this case, the production of a replica takes place very slowly and over long periods of time. In the field of art as well, the idea of an unassailable original developed historically in the Western world. So we find that the continuous restoration is done in a different manner, and it is something where the basic conception of restoration or changes to the original is very different between the Japanese shrine and the cathedral in Germany, so the Western cathedral. So we find that both are continually undergoing restoration is a valid point, but it is not a similarity. It is mentioned in the passage as a point of difference, actually, which means that this is a valid answer. What we are looking for, let's not forget, in the question is something that does not express a similarity between these two structures. So one can be qualified. Option 2 says, both were built as places of worship. Yes, the Ise Grand Shrine is a place where millions of Japanese people go to pilgrimage every year. So definitely a place of worship. And while we are not told if the Cathedral of Freiburg Minster at present is used as a place of worship, let's not forget, it is a cathedral. A cathedral is a Christian, a Catholic place of worship. So originally it was definitely built as a place of worship. And we are not talking about, in this option, we are not talking about the present day. We're talking about when it was built. It was built, if it is a cathedral, it is definitely built as a place of worship. So both of these were built as places of worship. 2 is a similarity. We can eliminate it. Option 3 says both can be regarded as very old structures. Again, true. The Cathedral of Freiburg Minster, mentioned in this paragraph, dates back to the Middle Ages. Of course, attempts are made to preserve the stones from the Middle Ages for as long as possible. So we can infer that the cathedral was, while it is constantly restored, the stone is constantly replaced. The original stones or the cathedral itself was built in the Middle Ages, and then also by the Japanese conception of identity, by the Eastern notion of identity, the Ise Grand Shrine is 1300 years old. So again, this is a point of similarity, not a valid answer. We can eliminate 3. Option 4 says both will one day be completely rebuilt. Again, true. The Ise Shrine, it is completely rebuilt from scratch every 20 years. So even at present, it has been completely rebuilt, and it will be rebuilt once again in 20 years from its last rebuilding. So very true for the Ise Shrine. Also, we see that in the Cathedral of Freiburg Minster, there is constant examination for damage, and the eroded stones are replaced. The sandstone figures are copied or reproduced. Attempts are made to preserve the stones from Middle Ages for as long as possible, but as we've seen before, this material is soft and porous. It cannot withstand natural erosion by rain and wind. After a while, it crumbles. As a result, it is continuously replaced. At some point, even these stones, the ones from the Middle Ages, are removed and replaced with new stones. So even if it is not done now, at present, at some point, all of the original stone from the Middle Ages, all of the original sandstone, the sandstone figures, everything would be gone. It would be completely destroyed. It would be eroded, crumbled. So there would be a replacement of these. So it will completely, the entire structure would completely have been restored. So 4 is also a point of similarity. We can eliminate it. The correct answer is 1. Based on the passage, which one of the following copies would a Chinese museum be unlikely to consider as having less value than the original? Now, this is a complex question. First off, because it is inferential. Pablo Picasso and Vincent van Gogh, who are mentioned in all of the options, they have not been mentioned in the passage. So this is a pure inferential question. It's an application-based question. It is highly inferential. Second, the question itself is quite twisted and difficult to understand. Which one of the following copies would a Chinese museum be unlikely to consider as having less value than the original? Unlikely to consider having less value. Now, unlikely and less value. If both of these are considered to be negatives, two negatives combine and form a positive, which means that which of the following is an example of something, some form of art, which a Chinese museum would consider just as valuable as the original? That is what the question is asking us. In order to understand this, we have primarily got to understand the conception of copying from the first paragraph, the Chinese conception of copying from the first paragraph. There's another reference in the fifth paragraph which might help us understand a little bit, but it's not a direct connection with this. First off, we see the Chinese have two different concepts of a copy. Fengzhipin are imitations where the difference from the original is obvious. So from the original there is difference. Now this is not said to be of equal value as the original. These are small models or copies that can be purchased in a museum shop, for example. In fact, this phrase that can be purchased in a museum shop is also important in eliminating one particular option. Let's keep that in mind. The second concept is a second concept for a copy is Fujipin. They are exact reproductions of the originals, which for the Chinese are of equal value to the original. Now, this is where we find reference to the answer of the question. Are of equal value to the original. That's exactly what we are looking for. We have done that already. Unlikely to have less value than the original, meaning considered to have equal value as the original. What we are looking for are examples of Fujipin. And what is Fujipin? They are exact reproductions of the original. Now, let's look at the options. One says, Pablo Picasso's photograph of Vincent van Gogh's original painting, printed to exactly the same scale. We realize that we don't have to see the names, or we don't have to process the names Pablo Picasso and Vincent van Gogh. We can just consider this to be an original painting of high value. It's Van Gogh's painting, yes, sure, but it's something of high value. Even then, we would still understand. Let's keep as much clutter out of it as possible. So, a photograph of the original painting printed to exactly the same scale, but a photograph is just a photographic copy. It's not an exact reproduction. An exact reproduction would be art, a painting which is made to copy the original painting, which is made as a copy of the original painting. Again, remember, a photograph of something, of a painting, even if it is printed to exactly the same scale, is something that can probably be purchased in a museum shop. So this essentially is not essentially, but this seems to be an example of Fengzhipin. What we are looking for is an example of Fujipin. So this is not a valid answer. Let's see if we can find something better. Otherwise, we would have to default to this because this is at least close enough. We see that it is a reproduction, not an exact painting of as a reproduction, but a photograph. And it is printed exactly to the same scale. So maybe, perhaps. But if we find a better answer option. 2 says, Pablo Picasso's painting of Vincent van Gogh's original painting, identical in every respect. Now, by comparison, also, this is better than 1 because this talks about a painting of the original, which would come very close to an exact reproduction, which a photograph would not be. So by comparison, this is better than 1. And then again, it is identical in every respect to the original, which is referring to exact reproduction of the original, which gives us the idea that this is an example of Fujipin, exactly what we were looking for. So we were right on the money in eliminating 1. 2 is a very valid answer. Option 3 says, Pablo Picasso's miniaturized but otherwise faithful and accurate painting of Vincent van Gogh's original painting. So, otherwise faithful and accurate reproduction of the original painting, but it is miniaturized. Miniaturized, as mentioned here, Small models is again something relating to fungipin, something that can be purchased in a museum shop. So clearly not as good as option two. Option two is about something which is about a painting which is identical to the original in every respect. This is something which is miniaturized, so it would not be considered of the same value. 3 can be eliminated. Option 4 says Pablo Picasso's painting of Vincent van Gogh's original painting bearing Picasso's signature. Now, this suggests that it is similar to the original, but this has Picasso's signature, the signature of the one who has copied, the one who has reproduced the original work. And that again could be taken as a change in the original. It is not an exact reproduction of the original because the original will not have Picasso's signature. If it has a signature, then it would be Van Gogh's signature, not Picasso's. And this we can see is something which might be considered an intervention. Let's take a quick look at the 5th paragraph. Back in the 17th century in the West, excavated artworks from antiquity were treated quite differently from today. They were not restored in a way that was faithful to the original. Instead, there was massive intervention in these works, changing their appearance. Now, of course, this is talking about the West. This is not talking about the East or Chinese museums or Chinese in general. But we can see that when we are talking about the exact reproductions of the originals, this here is something that we would consider an intervention. It's definitely not something which we can say is the exact reproduction, identical to the original. So clearly, this would have lesser value as compared to what is mentioned in 2, a copy of the original painting, a painting which is a copy of the original painting, and it is identical to the original in every respect. This one is not. So 4 is clearly not our answer. The correct answer is option 2. Which one of the following scenarios is unlikely to follow from the arguments in the passage? Now, these are also options which are not directly referenced in the passage. They are based on arguments made in the passage. So this is also an application-based question, but it's rather straightforward. Option 1 says, a 17th century British painter would have no problem adding personal touches when restoring an ancient Roman painting. This is quite inferable. We can see this from the 5th paragraph. It says here, back in the 17th century in the West, excavated artwork from antiquity were treated quite differently from today. They were not restored in a way that was faithful to the original. Instead, there was massive intervention in these works, changing their appearance. So, a 17th century British painter, a Western painter, would have no problem, no qualms about adding personal touches when restoring an ancient Roman painting. They very well might make interventions. So this is quite understandable and quite acceptable, quite possible. Hence, 1 is not a valid answer. Option 2 says, a 21st century Christian scientist is likely to oppose cloning because of his philosophical orientation. Again, aligned with the passage, we see the evidence towards this in the final paragraph, the last paragraph. It is stated here, it is probably this intellectual position that explains why Asians have far fewer scruples about cloning than Europeans. It is stated here, he found a great deal of support. It's talking about the South Korean cloning researcher, Hwang Woo-suk. He found a great deal of support and followers among Buddhists, while Christians called for a ban on human cloning. At least the perspective of the Buddhists, the perspective of Buddhism is explained here. Now, it is in the words of Hwang Woo-suk. He says, and as you know, the basis of Buddhism is that life is recycled through reincarnation. In some ways, I think therapeutic cloning restarts the cycle of life. So this is the Buddhist view where they do not have any opposition towards recycling or reincarnation or rebirth. So they don't have, probably, this is the reason why, they don't have too many problems with cloning. But Christians do. Christians would be opposed to human cloning for whatever reasons. The reasons are not directly given here, but we don't need them. Christianity seems to be opposed to cloning. So 2 is also something which is likely to follow from the passage. We can eliminate it. Option 3 says a 17th century French artist who adhered to a Christian worldview would need to be completely true to the original intent of a painting when restoring it. This information in between, who adhered to a Christian worldview, is just additional. It is there to throw us off. We don't need this. What we need is the subject, 17th century French artist, 17th century, also European, Western French artist. This kind of an artist, such an artist, need not necessarily be completely true to the original intent of a painting. We see that in the 17th century, in the West, there were interventions made to restoring artwork. The restoration need not be faithful to the original. So this kind of a person, a 17th century French artist, a European or Western artist, would not have any problems with making the same argument as option 1. Actually, they would not have any problem in making changes to, or adding personal touches, making restorations, interventions to an original painting when restoring it. They don't need to be, they wouldn't have the need, the necessity to be completely true to the original intent of a painting, which means that this is not likely to follow. That makes this a valid answer. Option 4 says a 20th century Japanese Buddhist monk would value a reconstructed shrine as the original. Now, we have seen one reference to this in the last statement of the passage. As you know, the basis of Buddhism is that life is recycled through reincarnation. So, Japanese Buddhist monks might not have a problem with a reconstruction because they believe that recycling is a form of life. Recycle is a form of reincarnation. We have another indirect reference to this in the first paragraph, where we see that there are certain conceptions of copying among the Chinese. The Chinese often send copies abroad instead of originals, in the firm belief that they are not essentially different from the originals. And then we have a direct reference to this in the second paragraph. The Ise Grand Shrine in Japan is 1300 years old for the millions of Japanese people who go there on pilgrimage every year. But in reality, this temple complex is completely rebuilt from scratch every 20 years. So for these Japanese people, we do have Japanese here, Buddhist aligned with this, we can infer that this shrine is 1300 years old. While it is completely rebuilt from scratch every 20 years, they would still believe that it is as valuable as the original shrine that was built 1300 years ago. So for the Japanese people, or for a Japanese Buddhist monk, the value of a reconstructed shrine would be the same as the original. So this also is something that is likely to follow from the passage. Hence, 4 is not a valid choice. The correct answer is 3. Through meditation and the right attitude, one allows emotions to happen to oneself. It is impossible to prevent this, but one is advised to observe the emotions without necessarily acting on them. One achieves some distance and decides what has value and what does not have value. In the context of the passage, which one of the following is not a possible implication of the quoted statement? We'll not read it again. The quoted statement is quite long, but it is here in the third paragraph. We can see that this is the same. Now, the question is, which one of the following, which one of the given options is not a possible implication of this particular quotation? Let's look at the options. Emotional responses can make it difficult to distinguish between valuable experiences from valueless experiences. Now, we can infer this from two sections of the passage. First, we can see this from, somewhat indirectly though, we can see this from the second paragraph. The second paragraph talks about Stoicism. It also talks about these aspects, valuable experiences versus valueless experiences, or things which have value and things which don't. And we can connect Stoicism to this idea, the reference that we are looking for, because this is a reference to Buddhism or the ideology that Buddha promoted. But we see that there's a connection, there's a similarity. As Oatley 2004 points out, the Stoic idea bears some similarity to Buddhism. Buddha, living in India in the 6th century BC, argued for cultivating a certain attitude that decreases the probability of, in Stoic terms, destructive second movements. Now, if you look at the second paragraph, it says, prior to second movements, we can consider what is important in life. Money, power, and excessive sexual gratification are not important. Character, rationality, and kindness are important. This is the view of the Stoics. There is a comparison with this and between this and the Epicurean view. The Epicureans held a similar view, believing that people should enjoy simple pleasures, such as good conversation, etc. We don't need that, but not be indulgent in these pursuits. So they should enjoy these simple pleasures, but they should not indulge too much in them and not follow passions for those things that hold no real value, like power and money. Then come to the last statement of this paragraph, which says, in sum, these ancient Greek and Roman philosophers saw emotions, especially strong ones, as potentially dangerous. They viewed emotions as experiences that needed to be reined in and controlled, which means we can infer that these, because we see that the consideration here is what is important in life and what is not. So, if emotions are potentially dangerous, they should be reined in and controlled, then we can infer that they would probably make it difficult to distinguish between experiences with value and experiences without. Let's clear this out for clarity. Another reference to this, we can infer from the very given statement, the statement itself. Through meditation and the right attitude, one allows emotions to happen to oneself. It is impossible to prevent this, but one is advised to observe the emotions without necessarily acting on them. So emotions will happen, but responding to emotions or emotional responses, as we see it here, is not a good thing. One achieves some distance if one does not act upon emotions, then one achieves some distance and decides what has value and what does not. So we can infer from this that the converse of this would also be true, which means that if we did act upon emotions, then it would become difficult for us to distinguish between valuable experiences and valueless experiences. So this is something which is a possible implication. It is not definitive, but then the question is not asking us for something definitive. It is asking us for something which is not a possible implication. So this is option one, is a possible implication, can follow from the given argument. So one is not a valid choice. Option 2 says meditation allows certain out-of-body experiences that permit us to gain the distance necessary to control our emotions. Now, the second part of this is quite correct. Meditation can help us, permit us to gain the distance necessary to control our emotions. Sure, through meditation and right attitude, not acting upon emotions, one achieves some distance and decides what has value and what does not have value. Agreed. It doesn't talk about exactly about controlling emotions, because emotions will happen. It rather talks about acting upon emotions or not acting upon emotions. But we might say that this is something that we can infer. That said, they allow a certain out of body experience that's completely out of line. No such information has been given. An out of body experience is when it seems as if our spirit, our soul has left the body. Nothing like that is mentioned here. Even in the phrase one achieves some distance, we don't see the fact that this distance is between our spirit, our soul, our inner self, and who we are. So our bodies, even our souls, are not viewed in perspective. This distance is only talking about some clarity about what has value and what does not. So we cannot say that there is any out of body experience related. So we have a major distortion here. And we also saw that we have some distortion here, because we are not necessarily talking about controlling our emotions. We are talking about not acting on them. So this option is definitely something which has ambiguity in it, not a probable implication at all. 2 can be qualified. Option 3 says, the observation of emotions in a distant manner corresponds to the second movement referred to earlier in the passage. Quite true. We've seen the observation of emotions, advice to observe the emotions without necessarily acting on them. We see the connection between this and the second movement as introduced in the first paragraph here. The second movement is acting upon the emotions that we experience. There's some connection between that and the Buddhist thought process that we can see from the first two statements of the third paragraph. As Oatley 2004 points out, the Stoic idea bears some similarity to Buddhism. Buddha lived in India in the 6th century BC. Buddha living in India in the 6th century BC argued for cultivating a certain attitude that decreases the probability of, in Stoic terms, destructive second movements. So yes, it corresponds to, it can be related to, or it has similarities with the second movement as introduced earlier in the passage. 3 is incorrect. Option 4 says, meditation and the right attitude in this instance implies an initially passive reception of all experiences. Quite true. Again, through meditation and the right attitude, one allows emotions to happen to oneself. It is impossible to prevent this, but one is advised to observe the emotions without necessarily acting on them. So, emotions will happen. It is impossible to prevent this, which we see is being talked about here as an initially passive reception of experiences. Reception, because emotions will happen. We cannot stop that. It is not possible to stop that. It is an inadvertent response. But then we can control our actions. Whether we act on those emotions or not, that is within our control. So this is also quite true. This is definitely an implication, a possible implication of the given statement, of the given reference. So 4 is incorrect. The correct answer is option 2. Which one of the following statements, if false, could be seen as contradicting the facts or arguments in the passage? Now, this is a rather straightforward question. What adds to the difficulty here, makes it a little bit more complex, is the weird construction of the question. It has a kind of a double negative. Which of the following statements, if false, could be seen as contradicting the facts or arguments of the passage? So what we are looking for is an option which, if made false, would contradict the passage, which means that we are essentially looking for, invert the double negative, make it into a positive. We are looking for an option which is supportive of the passage, which supports the arguments made in the passage. With that in mind, let's look at the options. 1 says, despite practicing meditation and cultivating the right attitude, emotions cannot ever be controlled. Now, while there is a slight distortion here, even calculating that distortion, even accounting for that distortion, this is still opposed to the passage. This is contradictory to the passage, so it's not a valid answer. We see that from the third paragraph. Through meditation and the right attitude, one allows emotions to happen to oneself. It is impossible to prevent this, but one is advised to observe the emotions without necessarily acting on them. One achieves some distance and decides what has value and what does not have value. This is stated in the context of Buddhism, but as we see from the first statement, this is similar to the idea of Stoicism as well. Now, agreed, emotions happen to one. It is impossible to prevent this. So emotions cannot be controlled as such. But despite practicing meditation and cultivating the right attitude, doing this, at least in the context of Buddhism, a similar idea to Stoicism, it helps us at least be able to not act on emotions, have a reasoned or a reasonable or appropriate response, an unemotional response to emotional situations. So this is something which is contradictory to the passage. Hence, we can eliminate it because we were looking for something which supports the arguments of the passage. Now, just for this option, if we see how exactly it can be eliminated, how exactly it goes against the question, how it is not a valid answer. The question says if this is false, it would be seen to contradict the arguments of the passage. Let's make it false. Practicing meditation and cultivating the right attitude helps us control our emotions. With meditation and cultivating the right attitude, emotions can be controlled. Now, while emotions are not being controlled, we can exercise, or we can learn how to control our actions, not acting on those emotions, which means negating this option, negating option one, making it false actually supports the argument. What we need is something that, if made false, would contradict the argument of the passage. So clearly, this is not the answer. Option 2 says, in the Stoic view, choosing a reasoned, unemotional response as the first movement is an appropriate response to emotional situations. This is irrelevant. It doesn't make any difference. So this is not a valid answer. We see that there is a major distortion here. This says that choosing a reasoned, unemotional response as the first movement is an appropriate response to an emotional situation. The last statement of the first paragraph says it's actually the second movement. In the Stoic view, choosing a reasoned, unemotional response as the second movement is the only appropriate response. The second movement, not the first. In two references in the passage, we have the first movement defined as involuntary, something that we don't have control over. The first reference is here. The first movement is the immediate feeling and other reactions. Example, physiological response that occur when a stimulus or event occurs. For instance, consider what could have happened if an army general accused Marcus Aurelius of treason in front of other officers. The first movement for Marcus may have been internal surprise and anger in response to this insult, accompanied perhaps by some involuntary physiological and expressive responses, such as face flushing and a movement of the eyebrows. The second movement is what one does next about the emotion. The second movement is acting upon the emotion. The first movement cannot be controlled. The second movement can, as we see here. Another reference to this, a qualifying reference, is in the last paragraph. We've already seen the reference though. Through meditation and the right attitude, one allows emotions to happen to oneself. It is impossible to prevent this, but one is advised to observe the emotions without necessarily acting on them. So what we are trying to stop here is the destructive second movements. The first movement, which is the happening of emotions, that is going to happen. It is impossible to prevent this or to control this, which means that this is completely distorted. False or true, it does not impact the argument of the passage, because it contradicts, because it goes against the argument. It does not encapsulate the argument. So 2 is not a valid answer. Option 3 says, in the Epicurean view, indulging in simple pleasures is not desirable. This is a valid choice. We see Epicureanism mentioned in the second paragraph. The Epicureans, first associated with the Greek philosopher Epicurus, held a similar view, similar view to that of the Stoics, that people should enjoy simple pleasures such as good conversation, friendship, food, and wine, but not be indulgent in these pursuits, and not follow passions for those things that hold no real value, like power and money. So the Epicurean view is that people should enjoy simple pleasures but not be indulgent in these pursuits. Indulging, having too much of simple pleasures, is not desirable. This is something which is directly supportive, directly aligned with the passage. Hence, this is a valid choice. We can also check why this is a valid choice from the original premise of the question. Let's make this false. In the Epicurean view, indulging in simple pleasures is desirable, is contradictory, because it is stated here, but not indulgent in these pursuits. If it is desirable, why would the Epicureans believe that it is not desirable to be indulgent in these pursuits? Or why would they suggest not indulging in these pursuits? Hence, we find that C, option 3, is actually a valid choice. We can qualify it. Option 4 says the Greek philosopher Zeno survived into the Roman era until about AD 300. Again, a complete distortion. We can see this from the first statement. Stoicism was founded in 300 BC by the Greek philosopher Zeno, and survived into the Roman era until about AD 300. So Stoicism survived into the Roman era until AD 300. Zeno, we have no idea about. So this is information insufficient. We cannot draw any judgments based on this, whether Zeno survived till AD 300, etc., etc. Seems very unlikely, because in 300 BC, Zeno had founded Stoicism. So AD 300, which is about 600 years after Zeno, unless he was an immortal, would definitely not be alive. So this is completely irrelevant, doesn't make any sense. Even if we make this false, it would seemingly be aligned with the passage. So 4 is not a valid choice. The correct answer is 3. Which one of the following statements would be an accurate inference from the example of Marcus Aurelius? The example of Marcus Aurelius is here in the first paragraph. Let's read these few lines. The first movement is the immediate feeling and other reactions, example, physiological response that occur when a stimulus or event occurs. For instance, consider what could have happened if an army general accused Marcus Aurelius of treason in front of other officers. The first movement for Marcus may have been internal, surprise and anger in response to this insult, accompanied perhaps by some involuntary physiological and expressive responses. The second movement is what one does next about the emotion. Second movement behaviors occur after thinking and are under one's control. Examples of second movements for Marcus might have been including a plot to seek revenge, action signifying deference and appeasement, or perhaps proceeding as he would have proceeded whether or not this event occurred. So that is the example. Let's look at the options. Option 1 says Marcus Aurelius was one of the leaders of the Roman army. Quite possible, quite inferable. If one army general accused Marcus Aurelius of treason in front of other officers, so there is Marcus Aurelius discussed in the context of the army, the military, army generals in the mix. So Marcus Aurelius might have been a leader of the Roman army, a general himself. That's quite understandable. That's quite inferable. Also, could Marcus Aurelius be the ruler? Not likely, because then in the second movement, Marcus would might have plotted to seek revenge. The ruler, the Caesar, if he were that, would directly have this army general punished, probably have this general executed. So it's quite possible that Marcus Aurelius was one of the leaders of the Roman army. 1 is a valid choice. 2 says Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic whose philosophy survived into the Roman era. Stoicism, as we see from the first statement, survived into the Roman era. Was Marcus Aurelius a Stoic? We don't know. No such information has been given in the passage, so we cannot draw this judgment. 2 is incorrect. Option 3 says Marcus Aurelius was humiliated by the accusation of treason in front of the other officers. This is invalid. It takes the given example too seriously. Consider what could have happened if an army general accused Marcus Aurelius of treason in front of the other officers. Could have happened does not mean that this did happen. So this is an example taken too literally. 3 is incorrect. We can eliminate it. Option 4 has the same problem. It says Marcus Aurelius plotted revenge in his quest for justice. Marcus Aurelius might have included a plot to seek revenge. Does not mean that Marcus Aurelius was insulted. He was looking for justice and he plotted revenge. None of that can be inferred. This again takes the example of consider what might have happened. This takes it as something that did happen. This takes the example too literally. So 4 is incorrect. The correct answer is option 1. On the basis of the passage, which one of the following statements can be regarded as true? Now, interestingly, for a passage this complex, this is a very straightforward direct reference question. Option 1 says the Stoic influences can be seen in multiple religions. Quite true. Direct reference to the third paragraph. Additionally, the Stoic idea of developing virtue in oneself, of becoming a good person, which the Stoics believed we could do because we have a touch of the divine, laid the foundation of 3 monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. As with Stoicism, tenets of these religions include controlling our emotions lest we engage in sinful behavior. So yes, the Stoic influence can be seen in at least these 3 religions. So this is quite true. We can qualify 1 as a valid answer. Option 2 says, There were no Stoics in India at the time of the Roman civilization. This is completely information insufficient. We see the only reference to India is here, also in the third paragraph, but it's not connected to Stoicism in any direct way. As Oatley 2004 points out, the Stoic idea bears some similarity to Buddhism. Buddha, living in India in the 6th century BC, argued for cultivating a certain attitude that decreases the probability of, in Stoic terms, destructive second movements. That said, were there Stoics in India at the time of the Roman civilization? Were there Stoics in India ever, at any point of time? We don't know. We cannot tell because such information is not given. The only information about is India is in the context of Buddha and Buddhism. So, two cannot be justified. Option 3 says the Stoics valorize the pursuit of money, power, and sexual gratification. Completely incorrect again, directly contradictory to the passage. Valorized means legitimized, give value to something. Not true. The second paragraph says the Stoics believe that to live the good life and be a good person, we need to free ourselves of nearly all desires, such as too much desire for money, power, or sexual gratification. So the Stoics were actually opposed to money, pursuit of money, power, and sexual gratification. They definitely did not valorize it. So 3 is incorrect. Option 4 says the Epicureans believed in controlling all emotions. This is an exaggeration, a severe exaggeration. We see that here. The Epicureans, first associated with the Greek philosopher Epicurus, held a similar view, believing that people should enjoy simple pleasures such as good conversation, friendship, food, and wine, but not be indulgent in these pursuits and not follow passion for those things that hold no real value, like power and money. So, the Epicureans believe that people should not follow passions for those things that hold no real value. Does not mean that they were opposed to all emotion or they believed in controlling all emotions. So, this is again quite exaggerated. We cannot justify this. 4 is incorrect. The correct answer is option 1. Which one of the following statements could be inferred as supporting the arguments of the passage? Option 1 says, the romantic conception of nature referred to by the passage is the one that requires theoretical legitimacy. This is a distortion. The very last two statements of the passage, they say this. For the Frankfurt School, human nature, in all its transcending force, emerges out of a historical context, as that context is depicted in illicit joys, struggles, and pathologies. It's not directly stated, but let's say these illicit joys, struggles, and pathologies, they represent the romantic conception of nature. The very next statement talks about the less romantic conception. We can perhaps admit a less romantic conception in which those dimensions of human nature recognized by society are also granted theoretical legitimacy. So, this says that a less romantic conception in which those dimensions of human nature recognized by society are also granted theoretical legitimacy, which seems why option 1 infers that the romantic conception does not have, or it requires theoretical legitimacy. But notice the word also here. Does this represent a romantic conception of nature? We cannot be certain of that. Even if it does, we find that even the less romantic conception, that is also granted theoretical legitimacy. So is the romantic conception not granted theoretical legitimacy? Does it necessarily require theoretical legitimacy? We cannot be certain of that. The passage doesn't give us enough concrete information to infer the inverse of the last statement. So 1 is incorrect. Option 2 says technologies form the environmental context and shape the contours of human society. This is quite true. We can see this from the first two statements of the third paragraph. In accordance with this general line of thought, critical theory of technology regards technologies as an environment rather than as a collection of tools. We live today with and even within technologies that determine our way of life. So yes, technologies environmental context shape the contours of human society. All 3 points referenced here. According to the critical theory of technology, technologies are an environment rather than a collection of tools. We live today with and even within technologies that determine our way of life, that determine the contours of human society. So this is quite true. It is supporting the argument of the passage. 2 can be qualified. Option 3 says nature decides the point at which society loses its capacity to control history. Now, this again is a distortion. We can see this from the last paragraph again. On these terms, nature is what lies at the limit of history, at the point at which society loses the capacity to imprint its meanings on things and control them efficiently. This is talking about the point where society loses the capacity to do what? To imprint its meanings on things and control them effectively. It doesn't directly talk about the society losing its capacity to control history. So this is a distortion. Option 3 can be eliminated. Option 4 says, it is not human nature but human culture that is represented by institutions such as law and custom. Now, law and custom are references to the 4th paragraph. We'll have to see the entirety of the 4th paragraph to eliminate this option, but we'll see that human culture has not necessarily been talked about. If it has been, human nature has not been removed from law and custom. Let's see. As an environment, technologies shape their inhabitants. We've seen this in the previous paragraph as well. This is the reason why we have qualified option 2. In this respect, they are comparable to laws and customs. Each of these institutions can be said to represent those who live under their sway through privileging certain dimensions of their human nature. Laws of property represent the interest in ownership and control. Customs, such as parental authority, represent the interest of childhood in safety and growth. Similarly, the automobile represents its users insofar as they are interested in mobility. Interests such as these constitute the version of human nature sanctioned by society. So we find that laws and customs being referred to by this option here, institutions such as law and customs, they are mentioned here in the 4th paragraph. Technologies shape their inhabitants. In this respect, they are comparable to laws and customs. So is it human culture? Maybe. It talks about under their sway through privileging certain dimensions of their human nature. This is what we are talking about in the context of technology. Technology affecting human nature. Property represents the interest in ownership and control. Property being an example of law. Customs such as parental authority represent the interest of childhood in safety and growth. Again, an instance of customs. So laws and customs both exemplified. Then we have technology exemplified in the automobile. It represents its users insofar as they are interested in mobility. Notice the word similarly here. Similarly draws a comparison between laws, customs, and technology, which is instanced by the automobile. Interests such as these constitute the version of human nature sanctioned by society. Interests such as these here represents to all these 3. It talks about the automobile, technology as such, technologies, also laws, also customs. All of these, they represent or constitute the version of human nature sanctioned by society. So human nature is represented by institutions such as law and custom. If human culture, we might say this represents parental authority, represents human culture. Perhaps ownership and control represent culture, but we cannot say that these essentially mean human culture. They might. Even if they do, we can say that human culture is connected to, is represented by law and custom, but law and custom also represent human nature. So it is not human nature, the first part of this option, which we cannot at all conclude from the passage. Very likely it is completely not untrue, because human culture has not been discussed as such. So 4 is incorrect. We can eliminate it. The correct answer is option 2. All of the following claims can be inferred from the passage, except. Now, there can really be nothing worse than following a passage this complex with a question such as this, where the not only are the options references to different areas in the passage, but also there are inferential levels to the references. Anyways, let's look at the options. One says, the critical theory of technology argues that as issues of human rights become more prominent, we lose sight of the ways in which the social order becomes more authoritarian. Now, this is something which can be inferred from the passage. We can do that from the last statement, a very long statement actually, of the first paragraph. It belongs to a tradition extending from Marx to Foucault and Habermas, according to which advances in formal claims in human rights take center stage, while in the background, centralization of ever more powerful public institutions and private organizations imposes an authoritarian social order. So, as issues of human rights become more prominent, we are talking about the critical theory of technology, which is directly referenced here. Because of this, as issues of human rights become more prominent, so skip forward ahead, according to which advances in formal claims of human rights take center stage, so they become more prominent, we lose sight of the ways in which the social order becomes more authoritarian. While in the background, centralization of ever more powerful public institutions and private organizations imposes an authoritarian social order. So, an authoritarian social order is imposed in the background, while human formal claims on human rights, they take center stage. So, we lose sight of the ways in which the social order becomes more authoritarian because it happens in the background. So we can infer this from the passage, meaning 1 is not a valid answer. We can eliminate it. Option 2 says, the significance of parental authority to children's safety does not therefore imply that parental authority is a permanent aspect of human nature. We can see this from two references, nearby references though, uh, the fourth paragraph and the beginning of the fifth paragraph. The fourth paragraph says, it talks about parental authority here. Customs such as parental authority represent the interest of childhood in safety and growth. We can see that laws and customs are being defined here. Laws here, customs in this statement. It says one line before this, each of these institutions can be said to represent those who live under their sway through privileging certain dimensions of their human nature. Now, if we see, the ambit of this is those who live under their sway, under the sway of these institutions. So parental authority represents those that live under the sway. So it represents the interest of childhood. The thing is, childhood does not remain forever. Children eventually grow up into adults. So parental authority is not a permanent aspect of human nature that we can understand from these lines. We can infer from these lines the sway of this particular custom, such as say parental authority, the custom of parental authority, its sway will eventually be gone because the interest of childhood would be no more. Children would grow into adults, they would be able to determine and ensure their own safety and growth. We also see interests such as these constitute the version of human nature sanctioned by society, such as these represents laws, culture, even technology, as represented by the automobile. Here, we see that this argument is then continued in the next paragraph. It says, this notion of representation does not imply an eternal human nature. So it does not imply something eternal. It does not represent something permanent, a permanent aspect of human nature. The representation that we are talking about are these representations. We are talking about law of property represents something, the custom such as parental authority represents something else, the automobile represents something else. These representations do not imply an eternal human nature. So clearly, Parental authority among all of this is not a permanent aspect of human nature. 2 is also inferable, hence not a valid answer. Option 3 says, analysis of technologies must engage with their social histories to be able to reveal their implicit and explicit meaning for us. This we can find in the third paragraph. We see that here, a hermeneutics of technology. Now, we don't know what the word hermeneutics is. Let's assume, even if we know, some of us know what hermeneutics is most of us don't. Let's assume we don't know, we don't need to. A hermeneutics of technology must make explicit the meanings implicit in the devices we use and the rituals they script. So they must make the implicit meanings explicit to us, the explicit meanings more clear, the implicit meanings more explicit. A hermeneutics of technology must do this. Social history, the next line gives us the reference to analysis. Social histories of technology, such as the bicycle, artificial lighting, or firearms, have made important contributions to this type of analysis. In the phrase this type of analysis, we realize that hermeneutics, whatever it exactly means, it is talking about some sort of an analytics of technology or analysis of technology. So analysis of technology, it must engage with their social histories directly mentioned here, to be able to reveal their implicit and explicit meanings for us. So make explicit the meanings implicit, the implicit meanings must be made explicit, explicit meanings must be made more clear. So explicit and implicit meanings, one can generalize from this and say, would be both made more clear by the analysis of technology. Hence, we find that this is also inferable from the passage. 3 is incorrect. Option 4 says, technologies seek to privilege certain dimensions of human nature at a high cost to lived nature. Now, we can find the reference to this in 2 parts. They are actually not related directly. They have been stitched together in this option. We're talking about technologies seek to privilege certain dimensions of human nature and lived nature. We see the reference to the first part of this in the 4th paragraph. Here, each of these institutions can be said to represent those who live under their sway through privileging certain dimensions of their human nature. And we are talking about laws and customs in these institutions. They are comparable to technologies. Technologies shape their inhabitants in this respect. They are comparable to laws and customs. Each of these institutions, they try to privilege certain dimensions of human nature. So the first part is here in the 4th paragraph. In fact, we'll have to move a little further. Let's clear this out and move over to the 5th paragraph. Now here we'll see, we were looking at this reference. Technologies shape their inhabitants. In this respect, they are comparable to laws and customs. So technologies and laws and customs, or laws and customs like technologies, these institutions represent those who live under their sway through privileging certain dimensions of their human nature. We can see lived nature, the reference to lived nature in the 5th paragraph, the last paragraph. The reference here is, of course, not to the nature of natural science, but to the lived nature in which we find ourselves and which we are. That said, we find that there is absolutely no reference to a high cost of technology seeking to privilege certain dimensions of lived nature, etc., etc. First off, these 2 references not directly connected. Second, there's no reference to high cost. There are no costs of this mentioned. It is something that it does, that needs to be done, that it does. So the aspect of high cost, the argument of high cost, is completely outside the premise. So we find that this is not something we can infer from the passage. The correct answer is option 4. Which one of the following statements best reflects the main argument of the 4th paragraph of the passage? This is a direct reference to the 4th paragraph here. Let's look at the options. Option 1 says automobiles represent the interest in mobility present in human nature. This is true according to the fourth paragraph, but it's quite limited. It's a reference here. Similarly, the automobile represents its users insofar as they are interested in mobility. Sure, true. But what about laws and customs? They form a large part of this paragraph. They are not referenced in this option. So 1 is limited, does not represent the entirety of the fourth paragraph. 2 says technology, laws, and customs are not unlike each other if considered as institutions. This is quite a valid choice. We see that it is mentioned here as an environment, technology shape their inhabitants. So we're talking about technology. In this respect, they are comparable to laws and customs. Not only are we talking about laws and customs, we are also saying that they are not unlike each other. So they are quite similar, they are comparable. Each of these institutions, so considered, if considered as institutions, is also qualified, can be said to represent those who live under their sway through privileging certain dimensions of the human nature. One instance of laws is given, one instance of customs is given, one instance of technology in the automobile is given. And then finally, it is mentioned interests such as these constitute the version of human nature sanctioned by society. So, interests or institutions such as these, which are similar to each other, they are um, those which are sanctioned by they constitute the version of human nature which is sanctioned by society. So this is quite true. We can say that this reflects the entire argument of the fourth paragraph. 2 is a valid choice. Option 3 says technological environments prevent certain dimensions of human nature as effectively as laws and customs. Again, this is true, but it's limited. We have seen the reference here. Each of these institutions can be said to represent those who live under their sway through privileging certain dimensions of their human nature. When we say that each of these institutions can be said to represent those who live under their sway, privileging certain dimensions of their human nature. We are talking about technologies not very different from or comparable to laws and customs. So technological environments privilege certain dimensions of human nature, direct reference, as effectively as laws and customs, but it still represents only one line of one statement of um, this passage. It doesn't talk about the examples, it doesn't cover all of them. The main argument here is that these are alike in this, at least this one respect. So 2 is by comparison a better choice. 3 is incorrect. Option 4 says technology, laws, and customs are comparable but dissimilar phenomena. Quite directly incorrect. In this respect, they are comparable to laws and customs, which means that they are similar, they are not dissimilar at all. 4 can be eliminated. The correct answer is option 2. Which one of the following statements contradicts the arguments of the passage? Option 1 says, masses are organized in patterns set by Foucault's prisons and Habermas's public sphere. This is directly contradictory to the passage. It's a severe distortion. We can see that from the second paragraph. Actually, all of these options refer to the second paragraph. This is relating to the third statement. This trajectory arose from the problem of command over a disempowered and de-skilled labor force. But everywhere that masses are organized, whether it be Foucault's prisons or Habermas's public sphere, the same pattern prevailed. What this is talking about is the trajectory that Marx defined. So we find here something quite opposite. If you look at it carefully, something quite opposite to what the option says. The statement says that the same pattern was found everywhere that masses are organized. The option says masses are organized in patterns set by Foucault's prisons or Habermas's public spheres. Foucault's prisons or Habermas's public sphere are examples of where masses are organized. So this is trying to say that the pattern is set by the organized masses, while the statement says that wherever masses are organized, the same pattern prevails. So this is something which is, if you look at the essence of it, this is directly contradictory to the passage. So it does contradict the argument of the passage. One is a valid choice. Option 2 says, Marx's understanding of the capitalist rationalization of production and Marcuse's understanding of a project of technological rationality share theoretical inclinations. That's quite correct. It's aligned with the passage. So we can see that from these lines. The first line defines Marx's understanding of the trajectory. Marx attributed this trajectory to the capitalist rationalization of production. Skip to the end. Technological design and development is shaped by this pattern as the material base of a distinctive social order. Here also we are talking about the trajectory. The pattern is referring to the trajectory that Marx defined. Marcuse would later point to a project as a basis of what he called rather confusingly technological rationality. Releasing technology from this project is a democratic political task. We don't need that. But anyways, we find that both of these are mentioned in terms of a similarity, which means that they have or they share theoretical inclinations. So this is something which we can definitely infer from the passage. So 2 is not a valid choice. Option 3 says the problem of command over a disempowered and de-skilled labor force gave rise to similar patterns of the capitalist rationalization of production wherever masses were organized. This is almost a direct reference. We can see that in the third statement itself. This trajectory arose from the problem of command over a disempowered and de-skilled labor force. But everywhere that masses are organized, the same pattern prevails. So we find that these two, the statement and the option, they are talking about the same issue as such, or they're making the same argument in essence. Hence, 3 is also something which is very, very much aligned with the argument of the passage. It doesn't contradict it at all. 4 says, paradoxically, the capitalist rationalization of production is a mark of so-called socialist systems as well. Now, this is part inferential, part a direct reference. The direct reference is in these parts. The capitalist rationalization of production also includes social systems. This we can see from the first two statements here. Marx attributed this trajectory to the capitalist rationalization of production. Today it marks many institutions besides the factory and every modern political system, including so-called socialist systems. Paradoxically, what is paradoxical about this? Because a capitalist rationalization also includes socialist systems. Capitalism and socialism being two different isms of political theory. So 4 is also inferable from the passage. It can be eliminated. The correct answer is option 1. Which one of the following statements best describes what the passage is about? The central idea of the passage is the undead. That is the context, that is the central thread running through the entire passage. We can see the undead mentioned in each paragraph. So that is clearly something that defines overall what the premise of the passage is. By that, we can eliminate options 1 and 2 quite easily. Option 1 says the writer discusses the transition from primitive thinking to the age of enlightenment. Now, we'll see for another option here, but primitive thinking versus the age of enlightenment, these are aspects which are discussed in the passage, but the passage is primarily about the undead and the conceptions, the various iterations, the various forms of the undead, the evolution of folklore surrounding the undead. This option doesn't talk about that. So clearly, this is irrelevant. 1 is not a valid choice. 2 says, the passage describes the failure of human beings to fully comprehend their environment. Again, failure of human beings to fully comprehend their environment is vague, does not connect with anything directly in the passage. Even if it does, this option also omits the undead, and thus it cannot be the central idea of the passage. This cannot be what the passage is talking about. 2 is incorrect. 3 says the writer describes the ways in which the undead come to be associated with shamans and the practice of magic. Now, this does talk about the undead, but it also talks about shamans and the practice of magic. The entire aspect of shamans, witch doctors, even sorcerers, as we see here later on, the practice of magic, all of that is referenced only in the fourth paragraph. So this is still not quite there. It is a limited choice. 3 can also be eliminated. Option 4 says the passage discusses the evolution of theories of the undead from primitive thinking to the age of enlightenment. Now, this is quite true. We've noticed how the age of enlightenment and primitive thinking are parts of the argument, they are aspects of the argument, but the argument is primarily about the evolution of theories of the undead. We are talking about folklore surrounding the undead. Now, if you look at the passage, we find the very first line actually evidences this. The first line says, stories concerning the undead have always been with us. Always been with us. That gives us that, yes, from primitive thinking to the primitive ages, the prehistoric times to the age of enlightenment, there have always been these conceptions of the undead. But we can see exact references to these. From out of the primal darkness of mankind's earliest years come whispers of eerie creatures, not quite alive or alive in a way which we can understand, yet not quite dead either. Then it is explained further. We don't need to see that. The second paragraph, it progresses the timeline. It says, and as mankind became more sophisticated, leaving the gloom of their caves and forming themselves into recognizable communities, towns, cities, whole cultures, so the undead traveled with them, inhabiting their folklore, just as they had in former times. Now they began to take on more definite shapes. The third and fourth paragraph, they talk about something specific relating to the undead. They don't essentially talk about the timeline. The third paragraph talks about their abnormal status, the attributes, the inhuman attributes that were accorded to them, the power to transform themselves into other shapes, the ability to sustain themselves by drinking human blood, etc. And the fourth paragraph, as we've seen in a previous option, in the last option, in the third option, it talks about the undead being related, connected, associated with the practice of magic, with shamans, witch doctors, sorcerers, etc. And then finally, in the last paragraph, we have from the Middle Ages and into the Age of Enlightenment, theories of the undead continue to grow and develop. Their names become more familiar, werewolf, vampire, etc., etc., are mentioned in this paragraph. So clearly, we are talking about the progression of the theories of the undead from the primal darkness of mankind's earliest years, which refers to primitive thinking, to the Middle Ages and into the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment being the last age or era that the passage talks about. So clearly, this is a valid choice because it covers one, the central aspect, the undead, and also covers the progression of the entire passage, of the passages, the paragraphs through the passage. So we can qualify 4. That is the correct answer. Which one of the following observations is a valid conclusion to draw from the statement, from out of the primal darkness of mankind's earliest years come whispers of eerie creatures, not quite alive or alive in a way which we can understand, yet not quite dead either? The given statement is here, is the second statement of the passage. And we can see and we can understand from this very statement itself that it is talking about a time frame of the primitive years, the caveman era, mankind's earliest years. And we are talking also about eerie creatures, which basically represents the undead. These were creatures which were not quite alive, yet not quite dead either. So let's look at the options. Option 1 is a valid choice. It says mankind's early years were marked by a belief in the existence of eerie creatures that were neither quite alive nor quite dead. Exactly the references we've seen, just simplified a little bit. Mankind's early years, earliest years, marked by a belief in the existence of eerie creatures. There was a belief in eerie creatures, which was basically the undead, that were neither quite alive nor dead. This statement or this phrase rather here, not quite alive, not yet not quite dead either. So we find that one is a valid choice. We can qualify it. The rest of the options, very interestingly, all of them, 2, 3, and 4, they distort the idea of whispers as given here. When it says, from out of the primal darkness of mankind's earliest years come whispers of eerie creatures, it doesn't mean literally that these creatures were whispering. The whispers, they represent a belief, a fear even of the undead, but it doesn't mean that the creatures were actually whispering to the people of these times, mankind's earliest years. We see that this distortion exists in all of the remaining options, 2, 3, and 4. 2 says we can understand the lives of the eerie creatures in mankind's early years through their whispers in the darkness. First off, as we have noticed, through their whispers in the darkness means these eerie creatures were actually whispering in the darkness, but that's not the reference that the passage gives us. The passage talks about whispers in the context of a belief in them, which we have in option 1. We don't have that in option 2. Option 2 takes this phrase way too literally, first off. Second, we can understand the lives of the eerie creatures in mankind's early years. No reference has been given. The lives of these creatures was not a concern. The concern was the belief, the stories relating to the undead, the belief of these creatures. So their lives are not exactly of any concern to us. Moreover, they were not quite alive, nor quite dead. So what life are we even talking about? So that comes across as a complete, or that we realize that it is a complete distortion. Hence, option 2 is eliminated. Option 3 says, long ago, eerie creatures used to whisper in the primal darkness that they were not quite dead. Again, two counts of distortion. One, eerie creatures used to whisper, again takes that idea too literally. We've discussed why this is incorrect. And then that they were not quite dead. Whether these creatures whispered at all is in question. So whether they were not quite dead, not quite alive, none of that actually computes. And then also, if we say yet not quite dead, that is half the argument. They were not quite alive and yet not quite dead either. So this is at best limited. It also has a lot of distortion. So 3 can be eliminated. Option 4 says, mankind's primal years were marked by creatures alive with eerie whispers, but seen only in the darkness. Again, these creatures are creatures of folklore. They were not seen in the darkness or otherwise. So this is a complete distortion, a baseless assumption. Then again, the early years were marked by the belief on these creatures. The creatures were alive with eerie whispers. Again, that same problem. It takes this phrase a little too literally. It states that the creatures were actually whispering in the darkness. So still a lot of distortions. We can eliminate 4. The correct answer is option 1. All of the following statements, if false, could be seen as being in accordance with the passage, except. Now, this again is a very twisted construction of a question, something that this year's CAT seems to favor quite a lot. We see that all of the following statements, if false, could be seen as. This is an except type question. Let's keep that in mind. But what we need beforehand is in this phrase. If false could be seen as being in accordance with the passage. So if it is false, if it is negated, then it would become something in accordance with the passage. So directly, it is something which would be contradictory to the passage. but then we have the except as well. So we are looking for something which is not contradictory to the passage, or something which is in accordance with the passage. In simplicity, if this works out, if we can understand it like this, we have first a double negative here, which turns it into a positive, and then another negative here, which turns it back into this. So if we just, kind of like math, if we just cancel out this and this, what we get is we are looking for an option which is something in accordance with the passage. It takes a bit of effort to understand the question. The question is very oddly constructed, but once we understand the question, the options, they don't pose any difficulty whatsoever, because most of the options are direct references. Once again, we are looking for something which is in accordance with the passage. The answer would be a statement which is in accordance with the passage. One says, the growing sophistication of mankind meant that humans stopped believing in the undead. Quite contradictory. We can see this from the second paragraph. And as mankind became more sophisticated, leaving the gloom of their caves and forming themselves into recognizable communities, towns, cities, whole cultures, so the undead traveled with them, inhabiting their folklore just as they had in former times. So this option gives us an argument which is contradictory to the passage, not what we need. One is incorrect. Two says, the transition from the Middle Ages to the Age of Enlightenment saw new theories of the undead. Quite true. We can see this from the last paragraph. From the Middle Ages and into the Age of Enlightenment, theories of the undead continued to grow and develop. Their names became more familiar: werewolf, vampire, ghoul, each one certain to strike fear into the hearts of ordinary humans. So, yes, the transition from the Middle Ages to the Age of Enlightenment, it saw the evolution of the development of the theories of undead, or it saw new theories of the undead. Slightly generalized, but in general, it's this option is aligned with the passage. It is in accordance with the passage. So 2 is a valid choice. We can qualify it. Option 3 says, the undead remained vague and ill-defined even as mankind strove to understand the horror they inspired. Now, this is something which is true. This fact is true as we see from the first paragraph, but this is talking about as mankind strove to understand the horror they inspired. That actually is looking at, or it is talking about the last statement, in particular, the last statement of the second paragraph. As mankind started to try to understand the horror that it felt towards these creatures, the references here, some still remain vague and ill-defined, but as mankind strove to explain the horror which it felt towards them, such creatures emerged more readily into the light. So they did not, while only some remained vague and ill-defined, most of these creatures, they emerged more readily into the into the light. And we've seen in the last paragraph how they developed familiar names such as werewolf, vampire, ghoul, etc., etc. So again, option 3 is something which is contradictory to the passage, not a valid answer. Option 4 says the relationship between shamans and the undead was believed to be a strong and stable one. Still directly contradictory. We can see this from the fourth paragraph. The relation of the undead with the tribal shamans, etc., competent sorcerers, not soldiers, competent sorcerers, etc., that's given here. And then we have the reference to this option. However, the relationship between the magician and the undead creature was often a very tenuous and uncertain one. So it was definitely not strong and stable. Also contradictory to the passage, 4 can be eliminated. The correct answer is option 2. Now, if you look at 2 one more time, it says the transition from the Middle Ages to the Age of Enlightenment saw new theories of the undead. If false, let's first make this false. The transition from the Middle Ages to the Age of Enlightenment did not see new theories of the undead. Could be seen as being in accordance with the passage, except, so clearly if this is made false, we are looking for something which will not be in accordance with the passage. The transition from the Middle Ages to the Age of Enlightenment. Here, the theories of the undead continue to grow and develop. If we say that it did not see new theories of the undead, then it directly contradicts this line. So we find that this is quite valid as an answer choice. As we have seen before, the correct answer is option 2. In order to confirm their abnormal status, many of the undead were often accorded attributes which defy the natural order of things. Which one of the following best expresses the claim made in this statement? This statement is the first statement of the third paragraph. We see that after this is mentioned, it is stated the power to transform. So, accorded attributes which defied the natural order of things, the power to transform themselves into other shapes, the ability to sustain themselves by drinking human blood, and the ability to influence human minds across a distance. Such powers, described as supernatural, only lent an added dimension to the terror that humans felt regarding them. Let's look at the options. Option 1 says, according the undead and abnormal status is to reject the natural order of things. This seems okay at a very surface glance, but it is actually a distortion. What we are talking about here is many of the undead were often accorded attributes which defied the natural order of things. The according of these attributes, that was not what defied the natural order of things or rejected the natural order of things. It was the attributes which were against or which defied the natural order of things. These were abnormal attributes which have been described as supernatural. So 1 is incorrect. Option 2 says the undead are deified in nature's order by giving them divine attributes. In this context, there's no mention of divine attributes. We have abnormal status, attributes which defied the natural order. Such powers, described as supernatural, lent an added dimension of terror. There is absolutely no reference to these attributes being divine. So 2 is directly incorrect. Option 3 says, the natural attributes of the undead are rendered abnormal by changing their status. Yet again, by changing their status is something which is a distortion in order to confirm their abnormal status. So their status is not being changed. The abnormality of their status, their abnormality is being confirmed. So there's a distortion here. Also, the natural attributes of the undead are rendered abnormal. No, they were given abnormal attributes which defied the natural order of things. Their natural attributes have not been mentioned at all. So this is also quite distorted. 3 can be eliminated. Option 4 says, human beings conceptualize the undead as possessing abnormal features. Absolutely true. Human beings, in order to confirm the abnormal status of these creatures, human beings began to connect the undead with these attributes which defied the natural order of things. Such powers, described as supernatural, lent an added dimension of terror that humans felt regarding these creatures. So this is quite true. We can qualify this. The correct answer is option 4. The given statements are rather easy to sequence. We find that all of the statements are talking about collagen, and collagen has been introduced in statement 2. Collagen, one of the main structural proteins in connective tissues in the human body, is well known for promoting skin regeneration. This is where we have collagen introduced. So 1 is our opening statement. Rather, 2 is our opening statement. Let's clear this out. Next, we see that there are 2 statements on fish skin collagen. That is 1 and 3. 4 comes in between 2 and these 2 statements. 4 says the risk of introducing disease agents into other species through the use of pig and cow collagen proteins for wound healing has inhibited its broader applications in the medical fields. Now, it says when 2 introduces collagen and suggests its significance, 4 talks about why pig and cow collagen proteins have not been used for healing wounds, or rather, why its broader applications in the medical field have been inhibited. Then we see statement 3 coming in and stating fish skin swims in here as diseases and bacteria that affect fish are different from most human pathogens. So this problem, the risk of introducing disease agents into other species, that does not exist in fish skin collagen, because fish skin has diseases and bacteria that affect fish but are different from most human pathogens. So we find that not only does 4 follow 2, 4 also forms a logical link with 3. So we have 4 and 3 coming in next. 4 is our second statement, 3 is our third statement. After that, we can easily connect 3 and 1. Statement 1 says, fish skin collagen has excellent thermostability and tensile strength, making it ideal for use as bandage that adheres to the skin and adjusts to body movement. So when we see fish skin swims in here, this introduces fish skin. Also, it introduces fish skin as an alternative to pig and cow collagen proteins, because here the risk of introducing disease agents into other species does not exist, because the diseases and bacteria that affect fish are different from most human pathogens. Also, another added benefit, a kind of a slight change of argument, because so far we were in the last 2 statements, 4 and 3, we were talking about the risk of introducing disease agents into other species, which was not there in fish skin. We see another benefit, the other benefits of fish skin collagen, which are excellent thermostability and tensile strength, making them ideal for use as bandages that adhere to the skin and adjust to body movements. So we find that 1 comes in as the final statement, the fourth statement. And that gives us our sequence. The correct answer is 2, 4, 3, 1. Statement 2 is the opening statement. It says, shorter commutes support innovation by giving employees more time in the office and greater opportunities for in-person collaboration while removing the physical strain of a long commute. Now, we see that shorter commutes supporting innovation, this argument is introduced here. The other statements, they talk about innovation and the length of the commute, some form of the other. So 2 is the opening statement. It comes first. We can put that into sequence. Now, we find that 1 is a floater, so we'll come to 1 at the end. For the rest of the statements, we see that there is a pair in 4-3. It's quite logical. Some see the link between long commutes and productivity as support for work from home scenarios, as many workers have grown accustomed to their commute-free arrangements during the pandemic. So this introduces work from home scenarios, which relates to remote work in 3, but then 3 rejects this idea. It says this is not always the case. Remote work does not automatically lead to greater creativity and productivity, as office water cooler conversations are also very important for innovation. So we find that 4 comes first by suggesting work from home scenarios is a potential alternative, but then 3 debunks this, 3 rejects this, saying that remote work does not automatically lead to greater creativity and productivity. Office water cooler conversations are also very important for innovation. So we place 4, 3 in sequence. They are consecutive statements as well. 1 doesn't quite fit with this argument, so 1 cannot come in between them. Thus, we see one cannot also come before two, because two, as we've seen, is the introductory statement. And we are still talking about fostering innovation and growth, and commutes growing longer, these aspects introduced in two. So one can be placed at two positions. Either we could have one here, or we could have one here, that is before or after the pair 4-3. Now, if we check these, we'd find that this is not as good a choice, because one is still on the issue of some company leaders basing their decisions on locating offices. So it's talking about commutes and locating offices. 3 and 4, or rather 4 and 3, they changed the argument to work from home scenarios and the pandemic. This is not something which is mentioned or referenced in 1. So 1 connects better with 2, and it also functions very well as a bridge between 2 and the pair 4-3. We find that we can very well justify 1 being here, because we would have 2 speaking of shorter commutes supporting innovation. The resultant is some company leaders basing their decisions on locating offices to foster innovation. In order to foster innovation, what they want would be, what they require would be shorter commute distances, because they've seen that their best performing innovators suffered the greatest productivity losses when their commutes grew longer. When the commutes grew longer, it was seen by some that there is a link between these long commutes and productivity and support for work from home scenarios. So we ease into 4-3 from 2 through 1. So 1 functions as the bridge statement, the perfect bridge statement between 2 and 4-3. And that gives us the sequence. So we get statement 1 right after statement 2, 1 becoming our second statement in the sequence. And then we have the pair 4-3. So 4 comes in as the third statement, and 3 comes in as the fourth and final statement. We can clear these out. The final answer is 2-1-4-3. The most important task of a new type of question is to understand the ask of the question. What is the question asking us to do? We have a sentence here. We have to see where it fits among the given blanks, options 1, 2, 3, or 4. Let's read the sentence first, given sentence first. Then we come to the paragraph and go option by option or blank by blank. The sentence says, easing the anxiety and pressure of having a big day is part of the appeal for many couples who marry in secret. Now, we go to the paragraph and we read the paragraph and check option by option, blank by blank, whether this statement fits here or not. The paragraph says, wedding season is upon us, and after 2 years of COVID chaos that saw nuptials scaled back, you may think that the temptation would be to go all out. Then we have the blank. But instead of expanding the guest list, many couples are opting to have entirely secret ceremonies. Now notice that we have the appeal for many couples who marry in secret in the given sentence, while many couples are opting to have entirely secret ceremonies. This is where secret ceremonies are introduced. So we cannot have this statement, which talks about couples who marry in secret, here in blank 1, because that would come before this, where secret ceremonies have actually been introduced. So we can eliminate option 1. Continuing further, the passage says, with COVID case numbers remaining high and the cost of living crisis, meaning that many couples are feeling the pinch, it's no wonder that some are less than eager to send out invites. Then the blank, plus it can't hurt that in celebrity circles, getting married in secret is all the rage. We see that the sentence might fit here quite well. It is no wonder that some are less than eager to send out invites, because COVID numbers are still high. The cost of living crisis means that many couples are feeling the pinch, the financial pinch of getting married in a big ceremony. So, easing the anxiety and pressure of having a big day is part of the appeal. Plus, it can't hurt that in celebrity circles, getting married in secret is all the rage. So, we find that it is quite possible and quite valid, quite logical to fit the given sentence in the second blank. We can qualify option 2. Option 3 or blank 3 is the closest. Plus, it can't hurt that in celebrity circles, getting married in secret is all the rage. Then we have the blank. I would definitely say that secret weddings are becoming more common, says Landis Behar, the foundation of a therapy practice which specializes in helping brides and grooms manage wedding stress. Now, the given statement connects very well with the statement after blank 3 because it talks about secret weddings, which connects here. It also talks about this organization, a therapy practice, not an organization, but a practice, a therapy practice, which specializes in helping brides and grooms manage wedding stress, which might connect with easing the anxiety and pressure of having a big day. So, if we place the given statement in blank 3, then it connects very well with the following blank, but it doesn't connect with the previous blank at all. This connection doesn't happen because it becomes very erratic, it becomes very abrupt. It says plus, which might follow from the previous statement. It can't hurt that in celebrity circles, getting married in secret is all the rage, easing the anxiety and pressure of having a big day. So, from celebrity circles and getting married in secret being all the rage in these circles, how do we come to easing the anxiety and pressure of having a big day? There's no connection between, in fact, let's clear all of this out because it is becoming difficult to understand. But there's no connection between this statement and this statement. It's very abrupt. There's a much better, much smoother, and more logical connection if the given statement is placed in blank number 2. So by comparison, blank 3 is an inferior choice. We can eliminate option 3. Option 4 again is quite easy. We come to the end. We find people are looking for ways to get out of the spotlight and avoid the pomp and circumstance of weddings. Then there is the blank. They just want to get to the part where they are married. Now, at first glance, this might seem okay. It might seem as if the sentence may fit here, but let's look at the last statement more carefully. They just want to get to the part where they are married. So this is talking about skipping something. This is not talking about easing the anxiety and pressure of having a big day. It is talking about people looking for ways to get out of the spotlight, avoid the pomp and circumstance of wedding. They just want to get to the part where they are married. So it again doesn't quite fit here. It's a much better fit, much more logical fit in option 2. So we can eliminate 4. The correct answer is option 2. The sentence says, having made citizens more and less knowledgeable than their predecessors, the internet has proved to be both a blessing and a curse. The paragraph says, never before has a population nearly all of whom has enjoyed at least a secondary school education been exposed to so much information, whether in newspapers and magazines or through YouTube, Google, and Facebook. So yes, we are coming to the aspect of internet here, but this statement, the first statement of the paragraph, has a very positive connotation. The given sentence has a mixed connotation. Having made citizens more and less knowledgeable than their predecessors, the internet has proved to be both a blessing and a curse. We don't have anything to suggest that it's a curse, at least in the first statement. So we cannot have this sentence in the first blank at all. We can eliminate option 1. Yet, it is not clear that people today are more knowledgeable than their barely literate predecessors. Predecessors is introduced here, so clearly we get another confirmation that we cannot have the statement, the sentence in the first blank. Contemporary advances in technology offered more serious and inquisitive students access to realms of knowledge previously unimaginable and unavailable. Then we have blank 2. Then the statement says, but such readily available knowledge leads many more students away from serious study, the reading of actual texts, and towards an inability to write effectively and grammatically. So we find that now we are coming to an aspect. We have two very abruptly in between, but between these two statements, we have the aspect of it being a mixed um, thing, a blessing and a curse. We see that internet has had a positive effect on some students, while it has had a negative effect on other students. So positive and negative. The given statement, which talks about both a positive and negative, must follow this statement. So it cannot again come in blank number 2. So we can eliminate option 2 as well. Then we have blank 3. It has let people choose sources that reinforce their opinions rather than encouraging them to question inherited beliefs. Here we have a negative aspect. Let people choose sources that reinforce their opinions rather than encouraging them to question inherited beliefs, which means they are looking to seek justification for their opinions rather than having an open mind towards beliefs that they have inherited from other or they have learned from other people. So there is a negative aspect here, but yet again, we cannot have the given statement, the given sentence in blank 3, because the given sentence has a very concluding finality. The internet has proved to be both a blessing and curse. First off, this does not fit in 3 because then we again continue an argument of why it is a curse. We have established that before. It's a blessing and a curse. So we have a positive effect and a negative effect here. Another negative effect here. The statement in between seems abrupt. So we see a positive and negative effect. We conclude that internet has been a blessing and a curse. And then again, we speak how internet has been negative or how internet has been bad for certain people. That makes no sense. That seems almost like a rebound. We go from one argument to a conclusion and then back to the argument again. Comparatively, it would fit perfectly in 4 because negative, we have a positive aspect, then a negative aspect, then another negative aspect, and then the conclusion that the internet has proved to be both a blessing and a curse. So by that comparison, we can eliminate 3 and we can qualify 4. The most appropriate answer is option 4. Statement 3 is the opening statement. It says, the creative industry is receiving a lot of attention today as its growth rate is faster than that of the world economy as a whole. We have two key phrases here. One, the creative industry receiving a lot of attention. Yes, that is what this statement is about. This is reinforced in the other statements, but we will be talking about the creative industry, or as we see, the creative element in the other statements, and also the world economy as a whole. So we put 3 in as the opening statement. Next up, we have statements 2 and 1 speaking on the same issue. In fact, the creative element in the value of world industry would be larger still if we added the contribution of the creative element in other industries, such as the design of tech accessories. And then one says, the creative element in product design has become of paramount importance as it is one of the few ways a firm or industry can sustain a competitive advantage over its rivals. So we have a connection between 1 and 2. Here, 2 actually comes first because, first off, we see that the creative element is directly talking about the creative industry. Second, the value of world industry is connected to the world economy as a whole, as mentioned here. Third, we can see that 2 then connects with 1 because 2 introduces other industries such as the design of tech accessories. Notice the phrase design, the design. This then connects with 1, which says the creative element in product design, design connecting these two statements has become of paramount importance as it is one of the few ways in which a firm or industry can sustain competitive advantage. So we find that the pair between these two statements is in the order 2, 1. 4 is a floater, so we don't know where to place it yet. Let's place 2, 1 here first. Now, 2, 1 also are consecutive statements. We'll see why. Let's clear all of this out. We are through with these statements. Finally, let's look at 4. It is for this reason that today's trade issues are increasingly involving intellectual property, as Western countries have an interest in protecting their revenues along with freeing trade in non-tangibles. We see that this is a rather vague statement, and with this opening, it is for this reason that today's trade issues are increasingly involving intellectual properties. We realize that we cannot place 4 before 3 because we have 3 talking about the creative industry, which relates to intellectual property in 4. So 3 is still introductory. 4 would come after it, but we can have 4 here before the pair 2, 1, or we can have it here after the pair 2, 1. Once that is done, we realize that we cannot have 4 here because while the argument of the intellectual property and trade issues might connect with statement 3 or statement 2, the argument of Western countries having an interest in protecting their revenues along with freeing trade, etc., this argument, the second phrase, the second part of 4, does not connect either with 3 or with 2. So this statement cannot come in between 3 and 2 because it breaks the argument. It functions best if placed at the end, because then this argument, Western countries and their interest in protecting their revenues, freeing trade in non-tangibles, that becomes a sort of change of argument, which we can have at the end of the sequence. So 4 is best placed after the pair 2 and 1. And that actually gives us our sequence. So after the introductory statement 3, we have the pair 2, 1, which means 2 is the second statement, 1 is the third statement. And then we have statement 4 as the final statement, the fourth and final statement. We can clear all of this out. The correct answer is 3, 2, 1, 4. The central argument of the passage is that at the quantum level, there is no distinction between animate and inanimate objects, or at least what we perceive as living and non-living, or animate and inanimate objects. We can see that particularly in this statement. The distinction between animate and inanimate simply cannot be made when you enter the world of quantum mechanics and try to determine how those apparent subatomic particles, of which you and everything else in our universe is composed, are all tied together. So we find that this statement gives us the key argument of the passage. Let's see which option, which summary, connects with this the most. Option 1 says, the effect of stimuli is similar in inanimate objects when compared to animate objects or living beings. Agreed that there is something like this mentioned here, but that said, this is a very limited option because 1, it is only talking about one statement or one phrase actually, and then it doesn't talk about quantum mechanics at all, which is a very important part of the argument. So 1 is incorrect. Option 2 says, arbitrary distinctions between inanimate and animate objects disappear at the scale at which quantum mechanics works. This is quite perfect. Distinctions between inanimate and animate objects disappear at the scale of quantum mechanics. Clearly, this is what we are looking for. This is what the passage is all about. And we have read the passage, we understand that the rest of the statements in the passage, they are made in support of this argument. The argument made in the statement that we have highlighted. So 2 is a valid choice. Option 3 says quantum physics indicates that an astigmatic view of reality results in erroneous assumptions about the universe. Now, this comes close because it does talk about quantum physics. Quantum physics and quantum mechanics are roughly the same thing, generally speaking. But that said, an astigmatic view is something that we have not seen here. It is not mentioned directly. What does it mean? Let's assume we don't know what astigmatic means. Even then, result in erroneous assumptions about the universe is a severe distortion. We see that, yes, there are some erroneous assumptions about the universe, but it's not that quantum physics results in uh, or it indicates a view of reality that results in erroneous assumptions. It is actually the other way around. Quantum physics, it breaks the erroneous assumptions about the universe, that there is a distinction between inanimate and animate objects. Quantum physics or quantum mechanics show us that these two types of objects, living and non-living, so life and inanimate objects such as stones, are actually very much similar because they're made up of the same subatomic particles. So this is contradictory to the passage, cannot be taken as a valid summary. 3 is eliminated. Option 4 says, the inanimate world is both sentient and cognizant like its animate counterpart. Yet again, very limited option, because if at all it includes anything else, it omits the argument of quantum mechanics, which is a very important argument in the passage. 2 includes that. By comparison, 2 is a much better choice. 4 can be eliminated. The correct answer is option 2. The passage states that modern historians of medieval Africa knew about contact between Ethiopia and Europe. They just had the power dynamic reversed. The traditional view is that Ethiopia was weak and in trouble in the face of aggression from external forces, which has in the options repeatedly been stated as neighbors. But that said, they were in trouble in the face of aggression from external forces, so Ethiopia sought military assistance from their fellow Christians to the north, which is Europe. But the real story, buried in plain sight in medieval diplomatic texts, simply had not yet been put together by modern scholars. Recent research pushes scholars of medieval Europe to imagine a much more richly connected medieval world. At the beginning of the so-called Age of Exploration, there is evidence that the kings of Ethiopia were sponsoring their own missions of diplomacy, faith, and commerce. So the dynamic is actually quite wrong. Ethiopia was not weak. New evidence points uh, in the opposite direction. They were strong enough, powerful enough, and had resources enough to conduct or sponsor their own missions of diplomacy, faith, and commerce. Let's look at the options. One says medieval historical sources selectively promoted the narrative that powerful European forces were called on to protect weak African civilizations such as Ethiopia, but this is far from reality. This was otherwise quite all right, but it distorts the premise in weak African civilizations such as Ethiopia. In the specific context, what we see here, the traditional narrative stresses Ethiopia as weak. So we are not talking about other African civilizations, with Ethiopia being just an example. We are specifically talking about Ethiopia being weak. So we cannot accept this. 1 is incorrect. Option 2 says medieval texts have been cherry-picked to promote a view of Ethiopia as weak and in need of Europe's military help with aggressive neighbors. But recent studies reveal it was a well-connected and outward-looking culture. Now, this is nearly perfect medieval texts, that is a direct reference to the passage, promote a view of Ethiopia as weak, traditionally promote a view of Ethiopia as weak and in need of Europe's military help with aggressive neighbors or external forces. But recent studies reveal that it was a well connected and outward looking culture capable of sponsoring its own missions of diplomacy, faith, and commerce. We have only one slight distortion in medieval texts have been cherry picked to promote a view. This suggests an almost intentional distortion of history. While the passage doesn't quite say that. The passage says that these people just didn't understand. The modern historians of medieval Africa just didn't put it together. We see they had just the power dynamic reversed. So this can be an honest mistake, something that they didn't understand. They didn't realize what the true depth of this of these relations were. Also, we can see it here, but the real story, buried in plain sight in medieval diplomatic texts, simply had not yet been put together by modern scholars. So, can we say that modern medieval texts had been cherry picked to promote a view of Ethiopia as weak? We cannot necessarily say that. But other than that, this option is perfect. So, we have only one distortion, one small distortion, and that also is of low priority because it doesn't affect the summary that much. But because it does exist, let's not eliminate or qualify two just yet. Let's see if we can find a better answer option. 3 says, historians were under the illusion that Ethiopia needed military protection from their neighbors, but in fact, the country had close commercial and religious connections with them. Now, this was again otherwise quite perfect, but there's a distortion in the last phrase here. Historians were under the illusion that Ethiopia needed military protection from their neighbors. First off, grammatical mistake. Ethiopia, the neighbors that we are talking about are Ethiopian neighbors. Ethiopia is a country. So we have to have its here, not there. There would be referring to historians, but the historians' neighbors uh, were not affecting or they were not attacking Ethiopia. But anyways, even that said, at the end we have a more specific and a more defined distortion because it says, but in fact the country had close commercial and religious connections with them. Did the country have commercial and religious connections with the neighbors? We don't know. With Europe, definitely. Fellow Christians to the north, Ethiopia and Europe, most certainly. But with them meaning the neighbors, we cannot say that. The neighbors are only referenced here, not directly but indirectly, external forces. They did not have commercial and religious connections. Even the last phrase where it says the kings of Ethiopia were sponsoring their own missions of diplomacy, faith, and commerce, we cannot say that it was with these neighbors. These missions had been into these neighboring countries. So there is reasonable doubt in this option. 3 can be eliminated. Option 4 says, medieval texts have documented how strong connections between the Christian communities of Ethiopia and Europe were invaluable in establishing military and trade links between between the two civilizations. This is again quite limited, somewhat distorted, because it doesn't talk about the traditional view, the traditional narrative, which considered Ethiopia as weak, in trouble of the aggression from external forces, and so it sought military assistance from their fellow Christians in the north, which was basically the Europeans. So a lot of that argument, the traditional argument, has been omitted here. By comparison, 2 is a much better choice, despite that small distortion in the phrase cherry-picked, have been cherry-picked. So we can eliminate 4 and we can qualify 2. While not absolutely 100% perfect, 2 comes to be the closest, the most appropriate summary from the given options. The correct answer is option 2. The passage speaks about 2 issues. Petitioning and elections. Petitioning is considered to be superior to elections. We see that from the very first statement. Petitioning is an expeditious democratic tradition used frequently in prior centuries by which citizens can bring issues directly to governments. As expressions of collective voice, they support procedural democracy by shaping agendas. They can also recruit citizens to causes, give voice to the voteless, and apply the discipline of rhetorical argument that clarifies a point of view. By contrast, elections are limited in several respects. They involve only a few candidates and thus fall short of a representative democracy. Further, voters' choice are not specific to particular policies or laws, and elections are episodic, whereas the voice of the people needs to be heard and integrated constantly into democratic government. So we find that the strengths of petitioning have been mentioned, and by contrast, the weaknesses of elections have also been mentioned. An appropriate summary should include both these arguments. Let's look at the options. One says petitioning is definitely more representative of the collective voice. This is quite correct. And the functioning of democratic government could improve if we relied more on petitioning rather than holding periodic elections. Now, here we have a slight problem. While this is likely, it is still something which the passage does not directly say. So there is a bit of an assumption here. The functioning of democratic government could improve. We don't see this mentioned in the passage. So this seems close, but not exactly there. Let's not eliminate one just yet. It's close enough. If we don't have any better option, then we'll have to default to one. 2 says, by giving citizens greater control over shaping political and democratic agendas, political petitions are invaluable as they represent an ideal form of representative democracy. This is clearly not a valid answer because it doesn't talk about elections. It completely omits that point, and that is an important aspect of the passage. So 2 is out. 3 says, citizens become less inclined to petitioning as it enables vocal citizens to shape political agendas, but this needs to change to strengthen democracies today. This is completely outside the premise, again based on a completely baseless assumption. Citizens become less inclined to petitioning as it enables vocal citizens to whatever. Citizens becoming less inclined to petition has not been mentioned in the passage at all. It is just petition and its advantages versus contrasted to elections and its disadvantages, their disadvantages. So this is also incorrect. Option 4 says, petitioning has been important to democratic function as it supplements the electoral process by enabling ongoing engagement with the government. We realize that while this is talking about um, the two arguments, it is on point. One was also talking about the two arguments, but one was slightly weaker because there was an assumption here. The functioning of the democratic government could improve. 4 makes no such claims. It keeps to the argument. It compares petitioning with the electoral process. Petitioning has been important to democratic functioning as it supplements, it does better than the electoral process by enabling ongoing engagement with the government. Ongoing engagement with the government, which refers to the voice of the people needs to be heard and integrated constantly into democratic government. That is something that petitioning does. We see that here. As expressions of collective voice, they support procedural democracy by shaping agendas. Also something by which citizens can bring issues directly to the government. In contrast to this, elections have been called episodic. They are not always relevant. So we find that by comparison, 4 is a better choice than 1. So we can eliminate 1 and we can qualify 4. The correct answer is option 4.